All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for the Montgomery County LGBTQIA plus cultural competency training. My name is Katie Greeley. I use she, her pronouns. And this morning, this evening, this afternoon, whatever time of day it is, because you are watching a recording right now, you're going to join me as we navigate what it means to provide a safe space for LGBTQIA individuals and more specifically youth in Montgomery County. So the gay agenda, or the outline for our training today, will focus on key terms and concepts, why creating a affirming environment is so important, with a focus on health disparities individuals face from the LGBTQIA community because of minority stress. So that was a mouthful. We'll be going a little bit over like what exactly I mean by that later on in this training, and how as individuals, allies, teachers, staff providers, colleagues, coworkers, adults, you can create a more affirming environment for these individuals in our community. All right, so LGBTQIA. This is not a monolith to represent the entire community. What I mean by that, lesbian individuals, gay individuals, bisexual, trans individuals, queer, intersex, and asexual individuals, that's what the LGBTQIA acronym stands for, all have a diverse range of experiences, a diverse range of needs, and they're, other parts of themselves that cause intersectionality that shape their identity of who they are. So basically what I'm saying is the experience of a gay man is not the same experience as a Black trans woman. The experience of an intersex individual may be very different than a bisexual female's, right? So what's affirming for one individual might not be affirming for the next. We need to obviously think of this as a community, because it is a community that historically has stuck together, that has fought for each other's rights, that have taken care of each other, but also when it comes to an affirming environment for an individual person, right, that might look very different for a trans individual than it would a gay man. So something to just be mindful of and be aware of as we move through this training. I'll give a little bit more context and some examples of that later on, as we continue to talk about this community. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. This is a Venn diagram, okay? So within that umbrella, the LGBTQIA umbrella, that also includes transgender, which also includes gender identity. Gender identity and sexuality, they are two completely separate things, right? And then there's queerness that kind of links those two things together, and I'll talk a little bit more what I mean by that. So gender identity is who you are, and how you feel you identify, right? Based on your brain, what feels comfortable, what feels affirming, not based on your genitalia. Sexuality is who you're attracted to, who you may engage in sexual behaviors with. And so there's many different variables about how these two things can intersect, and I'll talk about that. And usually that is representative of queerness, right? And fluidity. But for right now, for the beginning of this presentation, gender identity and sexuality, two separate things. All right, so I'm going to be throwing a lot of definitions at y'all during our time together today. And this is not so you feel like you need to memorize and absorb all of these definitions in the moment. There will be a PDF made available to y'all of this presentation. And there's a lot going on here. And as a member of the community who's been out since they were 19 years old, and someone who's been doing this work now for over a decade, I still learn something new every day about what is affirming a new sexuality, a new affirming way to represent your gender. So when it comes to the topic of the LGBTQIA community and being affirming, just take on the mantra, never an expert, always a lifelong learner. If you keep doing that, you will be, and you move forward with an open mind, you will be an affirming ally and or individual of this community. So looking at these terms, a lot of these might be familiar to you, a lot of them might not be familiar, right? One that I'll call out that might not be familiar to everyone would be pansexual, which is the sexual attraction to a person regardless of their gender or sexual identity, right? So they're not so much focused on sex of the individual or gender identity. They're really more focused on who that individual is internally, and that is what they're attracted to. So that means they're attracted to potentially anybody, but what really attracts them to that individual would be who they are, what music they like, how they support that person, stuff like that. Bisexual, right? Bisexual Awareness Day was last week. Bisexual, y'all might be familiar with. It's individual to one or more genders. So just calling that out, it's not binary in the way that you can be attracted to male or female. Bisexuality means you're attracted to one or more genders. So you can be bisexual and be attracted to trans women and women, right? You can be bisexual and be attracted to trans men and women. So it's not just men or women, it's one or more, attracted to one or more genders. So just something to call out. Gender, right? So this is a whole other set of definitions and terms. Some of these might be, you might be less familiar with, right? As we, as a culture, become more educated on what it means to be trans, that there are more genders than just male and female. This is something that people might not be as familiar with as the terms when it comes to sexuality. So cisgender describes an individual who will be identified with their sex designated at birth, right? So that would be an individual whose sex designated at birth is female, and they feel like they're female. They feel like that is accurate for them. I am trans. I'm a trans non-binary person, right? So I was designated female at birth. And my story, I came out as a lesbian at 19. And that felt very affirming for me, but it wasn't until I was 28 until I realized what non-binary was, which is non-binary means an individual who identifies or doesn't identify with either some components of being male or female, right? And that can look different depending on the individual. So for me, what does that mean? I don't necessarily feel like I'm 100% female. I don't necessarily feel like I'm 100% male either, right? So it's not one or the other, or it's not, 50-50. It's, I feel like I like masculinity, I like femininity. I've always dressed more masculine, but there's parts of my female self that is traditionally feminine that I really enjoy and hold near and dear to my heart. So I didn't even know non-binary was a term that existed until I was 28 years old. I'm 32 now. And I felt like I finally found a home in terms of my gender identity. So people go on gender journeys. I think there's a lot of talk about like, wait, where was this 10, 20, 50 years ago? When we look at the history of trans people, they've always existed. And that's a whole nother conversation, right? You can see that in Western societies with the, two-spirit individuals and Native American communities, stuff like that. So it's more of that society has put a social norm on either gender roles being male or female. Way before Western civilization, there was an expansiveness of gender that was the norm rather than male or female. So these things have always existed. And I say that right now because most recent data from Pew Research Center says 1 in 6 individuals in Gen Z have realized that they are part of the LGBTQIA community. And then 1 in 4 of those 1 in 6 identify as non-binary, right? So I think this is really important that we familiarize ourselves with these terms moving forward and know a little bit about the history of gender and being trans or two-spirited, or, as we kind of begin to move forward with creating a more welcoming environment for those individuals. All right, the gender unicorn. This is a wonderful image. It's really helpful to break down the difference between gender identity, gender expression, sex designated at birth. It used to be sex assigned at birth, right? But The language is always changing. What's most affirming, and now it's sex designated at birth. So that's the most up to date way to put that. Who you're physically attracted to, right? And then who you're emotionally attracted to. So physically attracted to can be labeled sexual orientation. Emotionally attracted to is romantic orientation. And that's another topic completely. But when it comes to gender identity, again, is who do I feel like I am, right? For me, Katie, my example is like, well, society's telling me that I'm a female designated at birth. And some of that feels right, but there's something missing. And is that my only option, right? It took me till 28 to figure out, no, it's not. There's other things that I can identify as. So I found the term non-binary that felt affirming to me. That's who I am, right? Gender expression, how you dress. Do you wear, do you want to, cut your hair a certain way, paint your nails, wear certain clothes, this can be many different things, but it's how you choose to express your gender, right? And typically we see that manifest in society for cisgender people as either feminine or masculine, but there is a range in between, right? Think about David Bowie. He is one of the first examples of someone who was androgynous and walked that line between femininity and masculine. That's a great example, right? And someone who's an icon. And there's many different variables beyond David Bowie that can manifest. Sex assigned at birth. We're going to get a little bit more into that. Sex designated at birth in a moment as we talk about intersex identities and individuals, which is super important. But again, this is a great resource. It continues to evolve. It started as the genderbread man, right? And obviously they used man in that iteration of the gender unicorn. They had to change it, the genderbread person. So many ways to interpret this. Many different variables here, but gender identity is up here. Gender expression is external, and then sex assigned at birth, sex designated at birth is made up of several different things, which I'll talk about in a moment. So that's biological sex. So sex designated at birth, biological sex, right? So that's made up of 4 separate components. We have genitals, which obviously are a person's external organs of reproduction, right? So there's that, and there's gonads, which are the things that produce the cells for reproduction. So sperm or egg, so testicles or ovaries. We have sex chromosomes, which when we go back to our health class, maybe if we had proper health education and sex education, you were taught XX, which is female, and XY, which is male. There's actually many different potential genetic makeup of chromosomes. So anything outside of XY, which is male, and XX, which is female, will be known as intersex, right? And that can include XXY or XXX, XXO, XYY, and there's many different intersex conditions, or differences of sex conditions is another way to put it, that would represent this population. And it's actually more common than people realize, right? So, and then there's hormones, which are estrogen and testosterone, which affect sexual development. So on the range of intersex, which I'll talk about in a moment, right? You could have someone who has breasts, right? So they're genitals, right? They have breasts, but they also have testicles, right? And a vagina. That's one variation of intersex. You can have someone who presents 100% as if they were female, designated at birth, but wasn't born with a uterus. That's an intersex condition. You can have an individual who has, a penis and testicles, but has too much estrogen in their body. That is an intersex condition. So there's many different variables that this can look like, and there's not, it all depends on these 4 different characteristics, right? So why am I saying this, right? You'll hear people say like, there's 2 genders, and it's science, right? And actually what they're trying to talk about is sex designated at birth, and they're wrong, because science has proven, and the existence of intersex people is that there are more individuals outside of male and female when it comes to biology. So talking about the intersex population, I think is super important. It's there's been a lot of intersex awareness that has happened over the past 2 years. it's a more complicated identity than just sexuality because of those 4 variables that I just discussed. But they're a part of the LGBTQIA community. And just because it might be more complex doesn't mean we don't talk about it. So intersex people are born with sex characteristics, like I mentioned in the previous slide, that do not typically fit the binary expectations of male or female bodies, what I talked about, XX or XY. There's many different variables and traits of what this can look like. Sometimes it's obvious right away that this individual is intersex. Sometimes it's not obvious until later in life. Sometimes intersex conditions can be life-threatening and might require immediate surgeries. Sometimes it might be a matter of having conversations with doctors if an individual is born intersex, having a conversation with the child who is born with intersex, making sure they understand what their condition is before we move forward with surgeries. There's been a movement to postpone intersex surgeries on genitals until young people can really give consent for that to happen, so they understand what's going on with their body and consent to those surgeries, which otherwise can be very traumatic for those individuals. So there's a lot of information out there on them. I will include a resource at the end of this slide to learn more about intersex identities. What I've included here in this presentation is also the intersex pride flag. Another thing to note quickly, not all intersex individuals necessarily identify with the LGBTQIA community, right? So this is another example of when we kind of lump everything together in the acronym. An individual might be intersex, but they might not feel like they are a part of this community. They might be like, I'm just an individual born with a health condition. I don't necessarily take on my intersex identity and feel pride in that, or don't want to share that with other people, or don't want to see myself as the part of the LGBTQIA community, then that's okay. So just something to be aware of. And, and again, like what I want to say here is just because something is maybe a little bit more complex than other identities doesn't mean we don't discuss it. As I think there's an important space for intersex people in the LGBTQIA community. A lot of intersex people are also trans. And so that's also important to mention. There is a correlation there. So just, again, there's some nuances here and room for fluidity. And I think that's worth mentioning. Okay, pause. So far I've thrown 23 different definitions at everyone that's watching this recording. I've talked about biological variation. I've talked about stackable identities, right? Gender and sexuality are 2 different things. It's a lot. So if you're feeling like, whoa, this is a lot, I'm going to need to rewatch this recording, that is okay. With that being said, again, what's important for you as an individual that supports youth or wants to be a good ally to the LGBTQIA community, this is a reminder that this is a process, and to be gentle with yourself and to continue to learn and take in as much information as you can to be affirming. All right, the queer universe. So with that, I also want you to kind of reframe this learning experience this way. So queer I use as a term that represents anything not straight, not heterosexual, and not cisgender, right? It's ever expanding, ever growing. And the more awareness that we come of the variables and stackable identities, the more our minds expand and become accepting of those identities. We are conditioned to think in boxes when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to gender, when it comes to many things. What is successful, right? What is a good education? What does it mean to be a good partner? That can look very different for every individual, and the same applies to sexuality and gender. So with that in mind, just think of this experience and your commitment to educating yourself on the queer community as the queer universe. It will continue to change, it will continue to grow, and it's very diverse and very beautiful, and an open mind will help you be an ally and an affirming adult in many people's lives. All right. So we're going to switch to why, when we talk about health disparities, I think health disparities are really important because they help us understand why it's important that we create an affirming space. So I think most people would agree with this statement. LGBTQIA individuals are not the problem, right? I want to be very careful not to pathologize anyone who is LGBTQIA. That is not the point of when I talk about health disparities. People are not depressed because they're trans. They're trans and they're depressed, right? But a part of that is minority stress. So, when we talk about minority stress, some of you may be saying like, but wait, like we've come so far. Gay marriage is legal. I'm seeing more, their poses on TV where, there's so many trans people and there's so much visibility. Like if you've seen those things, yes, that's amazing. We've come a very long way. But, it still has an impact on us, right? Like I said, I'm 32. I was, 24, 25 when the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage. That was not legal for all of my adolescence until I became an adult. Right? What kind of message does that send to someone when the state doesn't recognize you? And even though that's not the case anymore, that's still an important factor. Don't ask, don't tell was just repealed 10 years ago. You weren't able to serve your country as a gay person. The trans military ban happened 2 years ago. Obviously, that has been reversed, but when you hear those messages coming from your government, what kind of impact does that have on individuals' self-esteem, self-worth, while they're trying to figure out where their place is in the world? 2021, we've seen a historic amount of anti-trans legislation targeting trans athletes, trans people in general, trans youth, making it almost nearly impossible for them to access life-saving medications and punishing the doctors who are willing to prescribe those individuals life-saving medications. And we look at the data from GLSEN. Bullying and discrimination of LGBTQIA individuals still is happening at very high rates across schools. So yes, we've come a long way, but we still have a very long way to go. So when we look at bullying in schools, right, here are some numbers that you can look. Again, this is from GLSEN's 2019 National School Climate Survey that talks about, is gay been used in a negative way? Have they heard other, homophobic remarks, negative remarks about gender expression, negative remarks about trans people? The majority of young people have heard that. And then the poll on the right talks about, what sexual orientation and gender expression, verbal and physical harassment, and then also physical assault. And still that is happening, right? So just something to be aware of. It's not, I think kids are more aware of it and more accepting than they were. And these numbers are better than they would be 10 years ago. But again, at the root of it, being different as a teen makes you vulnerable. And young people, might not completely understand the impact that they have when they make these types of comments, use gay in a negative way, or make fun of someone for just being themselves. The anti-trans legislation that I was talking about earlier, right? This is just a snapshot of what that looks like. You'll see most of it focuses on sports and bathrooms, locker rooms. And then you'll see that the orange there is focusing on medical care. And honestly, like I put this slide together not too long ago, it's probably outdated already because the amount of anti-trans legislation that we have seen piled on top of that. And what you'll notice, right, 2015 compared to 2016, what's the difference there? What did I just say? Gay marriage became legal in 2015, right, by the Supreme Court. And then all of a sudden, we saw this big increase in the T of the LGBTQ community being targeted with anti-trans legislation. And here we are today, 2021, right? The beautiful thing is we have a more visible community than we've ever had before, but with that visibility, there also comes vulnerability. And we've seen this increase in legislation against trans people. And again, if you don't think that's having an impact on people's health, you're wrong. Right. So when we look at LGBTQIA youth specifically, and young adults, they're 1.3 times more likely to binge drink, 1.6 times more likely to use marijuana, 2.9 times more likely to engage in IV drug use, and 3.3 times more likely to use cocaine than their non-LGBTQIA peers. When we look at the mental health disparities, right? Individuals who are LGBTQIA are twice likely as heterosexual men or women to experience mental health disorders. 2.5 times more likely to experience depression, anxiety, and substance misuse compared to their heterosexual peers. And then women who identify as bisexual are actually one of the most vulnerable groups, and because they face double discrimination, right? Bisexual is both men and women, but women specifically. They face rejection and discrimination from heterosexual individuals, but then also homosexual individuals because, there's many reasons that I, don't feel like are validated, but basically their identity isn't affirmed as a bisexual, right? Even queer people sometimes struggle with the idea that people can be attracted to one or more gender and that they're not checking one box or the other, right? So that happens a lot. Okay, when it comes to creating an affirming space, things you can do as an adult, easy. Put that sign, put that sign in your classroom. Let people know that this is a safe zone. Stand up against homophobia and transphobia. And it doesn't have to be, you don't need to stand up on your desk and give a speech. You hear someone use gay in a negative way, you call them out and say like, hey, why do you think that's appropriate to use that term to, say something negative? Not in my classroom, right? Make it known that that's not okay. Someone says something about transphobia, right? Again, you don't need to sit them down, but quickly address it and move on. Make them think critically about why are they saying those things. Because I don't think most kids are homophobic, but I think they just say things sometime without thinking through of the impact of their words might have on others. If you're a teacher, an educator, teaches history, sociology, government, math, there are so many important LGBTQIA individuals in history that have done amazing things. Talk about their contributions to math, right? The British soldier who cracked the Morse code that ended World War II, right? Or talking about Keith Haring, who's an amazing queer artist. Talking about individuals that we've learned about in history that no one ever mentioned that they were a gay man or a bisexual woman, like Frida Kahlo. So let's talk about these people, not just advocates, right? Like Marsha P. Johnson, who threw the first stone at Stonewall, which started the gay revolution, but individuals who were successful and had amazing lives and careers and were amazing artists, musicians. Freddie Mercury, bisexual man, his bisexualism gets erased. Let's talk about, and what I mean by that is he was represented as a gay man, even though he was a bisexual man. Let's talk about these people and share their stories, not just during Pride Month, right? Pride Month happens in June. School's pretty much over at that point. Let's talk about it, from August to May, and incorporate that into your teaching. Continue to pursue professional development. This is one example of that. But like I said, in a couple months, some of this stuff will be outdated. So make sure you're keeping up with appropriate terms, affirming terms, and then introduce yourself with your pronouns. Super, super important. It might feel awkward at first, but I also have made some changes in the way that I address people, how I introduce myself. It was awkward at first, even as a non-binary person. I still use she, her pronouns. I don't use they, them pronouns. I like she, her pronouns. Again, that's part of my femininity that I still hold on to, right? Katie, she, her, move on. My name is Marissa. I use she, her, move on, right? That's just a little wink at those who might be queer, might be trans, might be gender expansive, that you're thinking of them, right? I think it's a good norm to model. And then I think those are good places to start. And, there's certainly other ways that you can get creative as an educator to also create an affirming environment. And you know your community best, so go with that. All right. So that is my presentation for y'all today. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. My email is katie@preventioned.edu. katie@preventioned.org. I will be, hopefully working with Montgomery County in a little bit more capacity to talk about LGBTQI identities and creating affirming environments for them or their specific health needs, mental health too. But I hope that was a good place to start. I hope that was an informing presentation. And I hope to maybe I'll see you in person in the near future. Thank you all so much.